The security footage would later show exactly what happened that Tuesday morning at 9:47 a.m. A woman in a crisp military uniform walking through the entrance of the Department of Veterans Affairs building in downtown Phoenix, her posture straight, her steps measured and purposeful. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned their place in the world through sacrifice and service. But within 20 minutes, that same woman would be standing in a cold, sterile room, stripped of her uniform, her honor questioned, her service denied by the very institution meant to serve her. Her name was Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez, though the headlines would later simply call her the woman with the Purple Heart scar. At 34, she had already lived more lifetimes than most people twice her age. Born in El Paso, Texas, to a family of migrant workers, she had joined the Army at 18, seeking not just opportunity, but purpose. What she found instead was a calling that would cost her everything and give her even more in return. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That morning, Maria had driven 3 hours from her small apartment in Tucson to attend what should have been a routine appointment. She was finally ready to apply for the disability benefits she had been avoiding for 2 years, ever since her medical discharge from active duty. The pride that had carried her through 8 years of service, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, and countless sleepless nights battling PTSD, was finally beginning to bend under the weight of mounting medical bills and an inability to hold down steady work. The first sign that something was wrong came at the reception desk. The young clerk, barely out of high school by the look of him, glanced at Maria's paperwork and then at her uniform with barely concealed skepticism. His eyes lingered on the ribbons and medals adorning her chest, particularly the Purple Heart, that held a place of honor among her decorations. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some additional identification," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made Maria's stomach tighten. She had heard that tone before, the subtle challenge, the unspoken question mark that seemed to follow her wherever she went in uniform. Maria reached into her wallet and produced her military ID, her driver's license, and her DD-214 discharge papers. The clerk examined each document with exaggerated care, comparing the photos, checking dates, even holding her military ID up to the light as if searching for signs of forgery. "Is there a problem?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. "We've been having issues with people wearing unauthorized uniforms," the clerk replied loudly enough for others in the waiting area to hear. "Stolen valor, you know. People pretending to be veterans to get benefits they haven't earned." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Stolen valor. The accusation that haunted every veteran who didn't fit the stereotypical image of what a soldier should look like. For Maria, who stood 5 feet 4 inches tall with kind brown eyes and a face that looked younger than her years, the assumption that she was somehow not a real veteran had become a constant companion. "I can assure you, these are my documents, and this is my uniform," Maria said, her training keeping her voice respectful but firm. "I served 8 years with the 101st Airborne Division." The clerk's skepticism only seemed to deepen. He picked up his phone and made a call to his supervisor, speaking in hushed tones while casting glances in Maria's direction. Maria could feel the eyes of other veterans in the waiting room turning toward her, some curious, others beginning to show signs of suspicion. Within minutes, a stern-faced woman in her 50s emerged from the back offices. She introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson, the facility supervisor, and her expression left no doubt about her opinion of the situation unfolding at her front desk. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," Mrs. Henderson announced with authority. "We have reason to believe there may be some irregularities with your documentation and uniform." Maria felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. She had faced enemy fire in the mountains of Afghanistan, had carried wounded comrades to safety under hostile conditions, had earned every ribbon and medal on her chest through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And now she was being treated like a criminal in the very place that was supposed to honor her service. What kind of irregularities? Maria asked, her military bearing preventing her from backing down despite the growing humiliation. That's what we intend to find out, Mrs. Henderson replied coldly. Please follow me. As Maria walked through the waiting room following Mrs. Henderson, she could hear the whispers starting. Other veterans, people she should have been able to count as brothers and sisters in arms, were now looking at her with suspicion and disgust. She heard fragments of conversation. Stolen valor. Disgraceful. How dare she? And each word felt like another wound to her already battered spirit. The walk down the hallway to Mrs. Henderson's office felt like the longest march of Maria's life. Her decorations, which had once been a source of pride and accomplishment, now felt heavy on her chest, like weights dragging her down toward an abyss of shame and humiliation she had never imagined possible. Mrs. Henderson's office was sterile and unwelcoming, with government-issued furniture and walls lined with regulations and procedure manuals. Maria was directed to sit across from the supervisor's desk, while Henderson made another phone call, this time to someone she referred to as security. The implication was clear. Maria was now considered a potential threat to be contained rather than a veteran to be served. I've been doing this job for 15 years, Mrs. Henderson began, settling into her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed they were about to expose a fraud. And I've seen every trick in the book. Young women like you, thinking you can put on a uniform, pin on some medals you bought online, and waltz in here expecting to collect benefits you never earned. Maria's hands clenched involuntarily in her lap. She had faced drill sergeants who could strip paint with their voices, had endured the skepticism of male soldiers who questioned whether a woman belonged in combat zones, had survived the bureaucratic nightmare of military medical boards. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, being called a fraud by someone who had never worn the uniform, never taken the oath, never put their life on the line for their country. Ma'am, with all due respect, I have provided you with all the necessary documentation proving my service, Maria replied, her voice tight with controlled emotion. My DD-2214 clearly shows my service record, my deployments, and my awards. I don't understand what more proof you need. Documents can be forged, Henderson replied dismissively. Uniforms can be purchased. But what I can't understand is how someone like you could have possibly earned a Purple Heart. That's a medal for combat wounds. And frankly, you don't look like you've ever seen combat. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Maria felt something break inside her chest. Not her ribs this time, but something deeper and more fundamental. Her faith in the system she had served, her belief that her sacrifice meant something, her trust that her fellow Americans would honor her service, all of it cracking under the weight of bureaucratic prejudice and willful ignorance. Mrs. Henderson, Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, I was wounded in action during my second deployment to Afghanistan. I spent 6 weeks in a military hospital in Germany, recovering from shrapnel wounds to my chest and abdomen. The Purple Heart isn't something I wear lightly. It represents the worst day of my military career and the day I learned what real courage looks like. But Henderson wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind, had already cast Maria in the role of the villain in her personal crusade against stolen valor. I'm going to need you to remove that uniform and those medals so we can examine them for authenticity. We have a private room where you can change into civilian clothes. The request hit Maria like a slap across the face. To be stripped of her uniform, to have her honor literally torn away from her body by someone who had never earned the right to wear it themselves, it was a humiliation beyond anything she could have imagined. You want me to remove my uniform? Maria asked, her voice hollow with disbelief. That's correct. We need to verify the authenticity of the ribbons and medals. and we need to document any discrepancies we find. This is standard procedure for suspected cases of stolen valor." Maria stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She thought about the day she had first put on this uniform, how proud she had felt, how it had represented everything she aspired to be. She thought about the ceremony where she had received her Purple Heart, how the general had looked her in the eye and thanked her for her sacrifice. And now she was being asked to strip it all away because her service didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of what a veteran should look like. "Ma'am, I respectfully request that you contact my commanding officer or the Army Records Department to verify my service before taking this step," Maria said, making one last attempt to preserve her dignity. "I don't think you understand," Henderson replied, her voice growing sharper. "You don't get to make requests here. You're suspected of committing a federal crime. Now you can comply voluntarily, or I can have security assist you." The threat was clear, and Maria knew she had no choice. She was trapped in a system that was supposed to protect her, but was instead treating her like a criminal. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, she followed Henderson down another hallway to a small, windowless room that felt more like an interrogation chamber than a place of dignity. "I'll give you 10 minutes, Henderson said, placing a folded hospital gown on the metal table in the center of the room. "Remove the uniform completely, every piece. We need to document everything." As the door closed behind Henderson, Maria stood alone in the sterile room, staring at the hospital gown that would replace the uniform she had worn with such pride just hours earlier. She thought about calling her lawyer, her congressman, anyone who might be able to stop this humiliation. But she also knew that fighting would only make things worse, would only give Henderson more ammunition for her crusade. With shaking hands, Maria began to unbutton her uniform jacket, each button feeling like another nail in the coffin of her dignity. She carefully removed each ribbon and medal, laying them on the table with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects. The Purple Heart was the last to come off, and she held it for a long moment, remembering the IED explosion that had earned it, the screams of her wounded soldiers, the blood on her hands as she tried to save them. The hospital gown felt like paper against Maria's skin, a stark contrast to the weight and substance of her military uniform now folded neatly on the table. She had faced enemy combatants, had stared down the barrel of loaded weapons, had carried wounded soldiers through hostile fire, but standing in that sterile room wearing nothing but a thin gown, while strangers examined her service record for authenticity, was perhaps the most vulnerable she had ever felt. Henderson returned with 2 other officials, a man who introduced himself as the facility's security chief, and a woman from what they called the Fraud Investigation Unit. They moved around Maria like predators circling prey, photographing her uniform from every angle, examining each ribbon and medal with magnifying glasses as if they were forgeries at an art auction. "This Purple Heart looks suspiciously new," the fraud investigator commented, holding the medal up to the harsh fluorescent light. "Most combat veterans I've seen have Purple Hearts that show more wear and age." Maria felt her patience finally beginning to fray. "Ma'am, that medal was replaced last year when the original was damaged in a house fire. The replacement process is documented through the Army Awards branch. I can provide you with that documentation as well." "Convenient," Henderson muttered, under her breath, making notes on her clipboard. "And I suppose you have an explanation for why your ribbons are arranged in this particular order?" "They're arranged according to Army Regulation 670-1, the same regulation that governs uniform appearance for all soldiers," Maria replied, her voice taking on the mechanical tone she had learned to use when dealing with impossible bureaucracy. "I can recite the precedence of ribbons from memory if you'd like." The security chief stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "Look, miss, we appreciate that you've done your homework, but the fact remains that you don't fit the profile of someone who would have seen the kind of combat necessary to earn these awards. The 101st Airborne, doesn't typically put people like you in combat positions. People like you. The words echoed in Maria's mind, carrying with them the weight of every assumption, every stereotype, every moment of doubt she had faced throughout her military career. People like you, women, Latinas, people who didn't match the Hollywood image of what a warrior should look like. People like me? Maria asked, her voice dangerously quiet. What exactly do people like me look like, sir? The security chief seemed to realize he had stepped over a line, but Henderson pressed forward with her interrogation. What we're saying is that your story doesn't add up. Young women, especially attractive young women, don't typically end up in positions where they would earn Purple Hearts. It's just not how the military works. Maria closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to center herself the way she had learned in therapy sessions with other combat veterans. She thought about her squad, the men and women who had served alongside her, who had never questioned her right to be there once she had proven herself in combat. She thought about Sergeant Torres, who had bled out in her arms while she tried desperately to stop the bleeding from his severed artery. She thought about Private Johnson, barely 19 years old, who had looked at her with trust and faith even as the life drained from his eyes. "Ma'am," Maria said, opening her eyes and looking directly at Henderson. On March 15, 2019, I was serving as a squad leader with Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 101st Airborne Division, when our convoy was hit by an improvised explosive device. Approximately 12 kilometers outside Forward Operating Base Lightning in Afghanistan. The blast killed 2 of my soldiers instantly and wounded 4 others, including myself. She continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I was thrown approximately 15 feet from the blast site and sustained shrapnel wounds to my chest, abdomen, and left leg. Despite my injuries, I returned to the blast site to provide medical aid to my wounded soldiers and help coordinate the medical evacuation. I remained conscious and continued to lead my squad until the casualties were evacuated and we were back at base. The room had grown quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Maria could see uncertainty beginning to creep into the faces of her interrogators, but Henderson wasn't ready to back down. That's a very detailed story, Henderson said, but stories are easy to research and memorize. What we need is physical proof. If you were really wounded by shrapnel, there would be scars. Significant scars that would be visible. The request hung in the air like a challenge, and Maria felt something shift inside her. For 2 years she had hidden those scars, had worn clothing that concealed them, had felt ashamed of the permanent reminders of the worst day of her life. The scars weren't just physical. They were emotional landmarks of trauma survivors, guilt, and the weight of command decisions that had cost lives. You want to see my scars? Maria asked, her voice steady now, filled with a quiet dignity that had sustained her through every challenge she had ever faced. If you're claiming combat wounds, then yes, we need to verify that those wounds exist, Henderson replied, her bureaucratic authority masking what was essentially a demand for Maria to expose her most private pain for the satisfaction of strangers who had never served their country. Maria stood up slowly, her hands moving to the tie of the hospital gown. She had protected these scars, had hidden them from lovers and friends, had avoided mirrors and changing rooms where others might see them. But now, faced with having her honor questioned by people who had never earned the right to judge her, she made a decision that would change everything. Fine, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 8 years of military service and 2 deployments worth of hard-won wisdom. You want proof? I'll show you proof. Maria untied the hospital gown with deliberate, measured movements, the same precision she had once used to field-strip weapons under hostile fire. Her hands didn't shake now. The trembling had stopped the moment she made the decision to reveal what she had hidden for so long. The gown fell away, and for the first time in 2 years, Maria stood before strangers bearing the physical testament to her service. Her sacrifice and her survival. The silence in the room was deafening. Henderson's clipboard clattered to the floor as her hands went slack. The security chief took an involuntary step backward, his mouth falling open in shock. The fraud investigator, who had been so confident in her skepticism just moments before, now stared in horrified fascination at what she was seeing. Maria's torso told a story written in scar tissue and reconstructed flesh. The main scar ran from just below her left collarbone diagonally across her chest to her right rib cage, a jagged, angry line where military surgeons had opened her up to remove shrapnel and repair internal damage. Smaller scars dotted her abdomen like constellation points, each one marking where pieces of the IED had torn through her body armor and embedded themselves in her flesh. But it was the scar tissue around her heart that told the most devastating part of the story. The shrapnel had missed her heart by less than 2 inches, and the surgical scars from the emergency procedures formed a web of healed tissue that spoke of how close she had come to dying on that dusty road in Afghanistan. The Purple Heart scar, as the media would later call it, was impossible to fake, impossible to research, impossible to explain away with bureaucratic skepticism. "Jesus Christ," the security chief whispered, his voice barely audible in the sterile room. Henderson stood frozen, her face cycling through emotions, shock, horror, shame, and finally, the dawning realization of what she had just put a decorated combat veteran through. The fraud investigator had turned away, unable to continue looking at the evidence of her own prejudice and incompetence. Maria stood there for a long moment, letting them absorb the reality of what they were seeing. These weren't the neat, clean scars of elective surgery or the thin lines of accidents. These were the chaotic, violent marks left by war, scars that spoke of blood and pain and life-or-death decisions, made in split seconds under enemy fire. "The shrapnel entered here," Maria said, her voice clinical and detached as she pointed to a particularly large scar on her left side. "It severed 2 ribs, punctured my left lung, and came within 1.5 inches of my heart. The smaller pieces you see here, here, and here," she continued, indicating various points on her torso, required 3 separate surgeries to remove. "Some pieces are still in there, too dangerous to remove without risking permanent disability." She paused, watching the faces of the people who had just minutes before accused her of fraud and stolen valor. "The largest piece of shrapnel, the one that made this scar," she traced the main diagonal line across her chest, "was from the door of our Humvee. When the IED exploded, it turned our own vehicle into a weapon against us." Henderson found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, I apologize. I had no idea." "No, you didn't," Maria replied, reaching for the hospital gown and pulling it back over her shoulders. "But that's exactly the point. You saw a young woman in uniform and immediately assumed I was a fraud. You saw my Purple Heart and decided it was impossible that someone like me could have earned it. You stripped me of my dignity, my uniform, and my honor because I didn't fit your idea of what a combat veteran should look like." The security chief cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we were just following protocol for suspected cases." Don't," Maria interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "Don't try to justify what just happened here with protocol and procedure. What happened here was prejudice, pure and simple. You saw a young Latina woman and decided she couldn't possibly be a real soldier. You saw my Purple Heart and assumed it was fake because people like me don't deserve medals like that." Henderson was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her actions began to sink in. "How can we ... what can we do to make this right?" Maria tied the hospital gown closed and looked at each of the 3 officials in turn. "You can start by remembering this moment the next time you see a veteran who doesn't fit your stereotypes. You can remember that courage doesn't have a gender, that heroism doesn't have a color, and that sacrifice doesn't care what you look like or where you come from." She paused, gathering her uniform from the table with the same reverence she had shown when removing it. "And you can help me get the benefits I earned with my blood so I can get the medical care I need for the injuries I sustained serving our country." The fraud investigator, who had been silent throughout Maria's revelation, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, I want you to know that your case will be expedited through our system. Whatever you need, whatever benefits you're entitled to, we'll make sure you get them as quickly as possible." "I don't want special treatment," Maria replied firmly. "I just want to be treated like any other veteran who walked through your doors today. With respect, with dignity, and with the assumption that I earned my place in this uniform instead of the assumption that I stole it." She began to dress slowly, each piece of her uniform going back on with the same precision with which it had been removed. The ribbons and medals were replaced in their proper positions, each one a reminder of service, sacrifice, and survival. As Maria fastened the last button on her uniform jacket, she could hear hushed conversation starting in the hallway outside the room. Word was beginning to spread through the VA facility about what had just transpired, and she could imagine the whispers, the speculation, the gradual shift from suspicion to shame among the staff who had witnessed her humiliation. Henderson had composed herself somewhat, though her eyes remained red and her hands still shook as she gathered her scattered paperwork. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," she began, her voice formal but respectful now, "I want you to know that this incident will be reported to my supervisors and that we will be reviewing our procedures to ensure this never happens again. With respect." "Ma'am," Maria replied as she pinned her Purple Heart back in its place of honor on her chest, "this isn't about procedures. This is about prejudice. Your procedures didn't tell you to assume I was a fraud the moment you saw me. That was a choice you made based on what you thought a veteran should look like." The security chief shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we do see a lot of cases of stolen valor. People trying to take advantage of benefits they haven't earned. We have to be vigilant." Being vigilant and being prejudiced are two different things, Maria responded, straightening her uniform jacket. "When a middle-aged white man in a uniform walks through your doors, do you immediately assume he's committing fraud? Do you demand he strip down to prove his scars are real? Do you treat him like a criminal before you even look at his paperwork?" The uncomfortable silence that followed was answer enough. Maria had served alongside veterans of every race, gender, and background, and she knew that the assumption of fraud seemed to follow certain types of veterans more than others. Women, minorities, young veterans, those who didn't fit the traditional image of the grizzled war hero. They were the ones who faced the most skepticism, the most challenges to their service. "I need to finish processing my benefits application," Maria said, her voice steady and professional. "Are we done here, or do you need to examine any other parts of my service record for authenticity?" Henderson shook her head quickly. "No, ma'am. Your documentation is clearly in order. I'll personally ensure that your application is processed immediately, and I'll make sure you're assigned to one of our senior benefits counselors who can help you navigate the system." "I appreciate that," Maria replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of Henderson's sincerity. "But what I'd appreciate even more is if you use this experience to train your staff about the diversity of veterans and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance." As they prepared to leave the small room, the fraud investigator approached Maria hesitantly. "Ma'am, I know this probably doesn't mean much coming from me right now, but thank you for your service. And I'm sorry for what we put you through today." Maria studied the woman's face for a moment, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus bureaucratic damage control. What she saw was shame, regret, and what appeared to be a genuine desire to make amends. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "But the best way you can thank me for my service is to make sure the next veteran who walks through those doors gets the respect they deserve from the very beginning." The walk back through the VA facility was entirely different from the march of shame that had brought Maria to the interrogation room. Now staff members who had previously looked at her with suspicion or indifference were watching her with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. Word had traveled fast through the building's corridors, and Maria could sense the shift in atmosphere as she passed Dot at the reception desk. The young clerk who had first challenged her documentation was nowhere to be seen. In his place was an older veteran, a man with Vietnam War ribbons on his jacket and understanding in his eyes. "Staff Sergeant," he said, standing as she approached. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened here today. That's not how we treat our brothers and sisters in arms." "Thank you," Maria replied, surprised by the gesture, but appreciating the acknowledgement. "I just hope something positive can come from this experience." "It will," the veteran assured her. "I've been working here for 5 years, and I can tell you that what happened today is going to change how we do business. Nobody wants to see a decorated combat veteran treated the way you were treated." As Maria completed the paperwork for her benefits application, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had joined the army to serve her country, and had ended up serving as an unintentional educator about prejudice and assumption. She had come to the VA seeking help with her service-connected disabilities and had instead become an advocate for veteran dignity and respect. The irony wasn't lost on her that it had taken stripping away her uniform and revealing her most private scars to prove that she deserved to wear that uniform in the first place. The purple heart on her chest, which should have been immediate proof of her service and sacrifice, had been dismissed as fake until she literally bared the wounds that had earned it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time Maria left the VIA facility 3 hours later, her benefits application had been fast-tracked through the system, and she had appointments scheduled with specialists who could help address the ongoing medical issues related to her combat injuries. But more importantly, she had sparked a conversation about veteran stereotypes and the assumptions that too often guided how veterans were treated by the very institutions meant to serve them. The drive back to Tucson gave Maria time to process what had happened, but the 3 hours on Interstate 10 weren't nearly enough to sort through the complex emotions churning in her chest. Anger, humiliation, vindication, and exhaustion warred with each other as she replayed the morning's events. In her mind, the desert landscape rolling past her windows seemed to mirror her internal state, stark, unforgiving, but somehow beautiful in its harsh honesty. She had expected the benefits application process to be challenging. Every veteran she knew had warned her about the bureaucratic maze she would have to navigate, but she had never imagined that the first challenge would be proving that she was actually a veteran at all. The assumption that she was a fraud had been so immediate, so absolute, that it had taken her breath away with its casual cruelty. Her phone buzzed with notifications as she drove. Word of the incident at the Phoenix VA had somehow leaked, and local veterans organizations were reaching out, offering support and expressing outrage at her treatment. A reporter from the Arizona Republic had left 3 voicemails asking for an interview. The VFW post commander from her hometown had sent a text message with just 4 words: "We stand with you." Maria wasn't sure she wanted the attention. She had spent 2 years trying to blend into civilian life, trying to move past her military service and the trauma that came with it. The last thing she had wanted was to become the poster child for veteran discrimination or the face of some. 'Cause she had never asked to represent, but as she thought about other veterans who might face similar treatment, women, minorities, young service members who didn't fit the traditional veteran stereotype, she began to realize that her humiliating experience might serve a larger purpose. If sharing her story could prevent another veteran from being stripped of their dignity and forced to prove their service in such a degrading way, then perhaps the morning's trauma would have some meaning. When she finally reached her apartment in Tucson, Maria found a small crowd of people waiting for her. veterans from the local American Legion post, neighbors who had heard about the incident through social media, and even a few active duty soldiers from nearby Davis-Monthan Air Force Base had gathered to show their support. Someone had brought a banner that read, "We honor all veterans," and the sight of it brought tears to Maria's eyes for the first time that day. An older veteran named Frank, who served in Korea and whom Maria recognized from the grocery store where she sometimes shopped, stepped forward as she got out of her car. "Staff Sergeant," he said, offering a crisp salute, "we wanted you to know that you're not alone in this. What happened to you today was wrong, and we're here to make sure everyone knows it." Maria returned the salute and found herself overwhelmed by the support of people she barely knew. These veterans understood something that the VA staff had failed to grasp, that service and sacrifice came in many forms and from many different types of people. They understood that a Purple Heart was earned with blood, not granted based on someone's appearance or assumptions about what a warrior should look like. "Thank you," Maria managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "I never expected. I just went to apply for benefits. I never wanted this to become a big deal. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones we never planned to fight," Frank replied with the wisdom of someone who had lived through his own share of conflicts, both military and civilian. "You stood up for every veteran today, whether you meant to or not. You made them see us as we really are, diverse, proud, and deserving of respect." As the crowd gradually dispersed, Maria went inside her small apartment and sat at her kitchen table, still wearing her uniform. She looked down at the Purple Heart on her chest and thought about the day she had received it. The ceremony had been brief and formal, with a general she had never met before and would never see again reading from a prepared script about her courage under fire and devotion to duty. At the time, she had been too sedated from pain medication and too overwhelmed by survivor's guilt to fully appreciate the significance of the moment. She had been thinking about Torres and Johnson, about the soldiers who hadn't made it home, about whether she deserved recognition for simply doing her job in an impossible situation. But today, forced to defend not just her medal but her right to wear it, Maria began to understand what the Purple Heart really represented. It wasn't just about the physical wounds she had sustained. It was about the willingness to serve despite the cost, the courage to keep fighting even when fighting seemed impossible, and the strength to carry the weight of command decisions that changed lives forever. The medal had been questioned, examined, and nearly taken from her by people who had never served, had never faced enemy fire, had never carried wounded comrades to safety. But it had survived the challenge, just as Maria had survived the blast that earned it, just as she had survived the bureaucratic battle that had tried to strip it away. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice on the other end was familiar. It was Mrs. Henderson from the VA facility. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Henderson began, her voice careful and formal. "I wanted to call personally to inform you that your benefits application has been approved and expedited. You should receive notification within the next few days, and your first appointment with our medical team is scheduled for next week." "Thank you," Maria replied, though she wasn't sure if she was grateful for the efficiency or suspicious of the motivation behind it. "I also wanted you to know," Henderson continued, "that we've implemented new training procedures for our staff regarding veteran verification and the importance of treating all veterans with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background." 3 days after the incident at the Phoenix VA, Maria's story had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a routine benefits application had become a national conversation about veteran stereotypes, discrimination, and the invisible wounds carried by those who had served their country. Social media was ablaze with #PurpleHeartScar trending across multiple platforms, and veterans from around the country were sharing their own stories of being questioned, doubted, or dismissed because they didn't fit the traditional image of what a warrior should look like. Maria sat in her living room, scrolling through hundreds of messages from veterans who had reached out to share their experiences. A Navy corpsman from California wrote about being told she was too pretty to have served in a combat zone. A Marine from Texas described being accused of stolen valor at a restaurant because he looked too young and clean-cut to be a real veteran. An Air Force veteran from New York shared how she had been asked to leave a Veterans Day ceremony because someone thought her service dog was fake. Each story was a variation on the same theme: veterans being judged not by their service records or their character, but by whether they matched someone else's preconceived notion of what a military hero should look like. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Female veterans, young veterans, minority veterans, and veterans without visible disabilities faced the most skepticism about their service. The phone calls had started the day after the VA incident. First, it was local news stations wanting interviews. Then regional papers picked up the story. By the third day, producers from national news programs were leaving voicemails, and a documentary filmmaker had reached out about featuring Maria's story in a project about modern veterans' experiences. Maria wasn't sure she wanted to be in the spotlight. She had joined the Army to serve her country, not to become a public figure or advocate. But as she read through the messages from veterans who had faced similar treatment, she began to understand that her story was bigger than her personal experience. It was about systemic issues that affected thousands of veterans across the country. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in veteran mental health, had driven down from Phoenix to meet with Maria. She explained that the questioning of veteran service, particularly for those who didn't fit traditional stereotypes, was a form of secondary trauma that could be just as damaging as the original combat experiences. When you've already sacrificed so much for your country, Dr. Martinez explained, being told that your service isn't real or doesn't count creates a deep psychological wound. It attacks not just your military identity, but your sense of self-worth and belonging. For veterans who are already struggling with PTSD, survivor's guilt, or adjustment disorders, this kind of treatment can be devastating. Maria understood exactly what Dr. Martinez meant. The humiliation at the VA had triggered something deeper than just anger or embarrassment. It had made her question everything about her service, her identity, and her place in the world. If the very institution meant to serve veterans could strip her of her dignity so easily, what did that say about the value of her sacrifice? But the response from the veteran community had been overwhelmingly positive and supportive. Veterans organizations across the country had issued statements condemning the treatment Maria had received. The VFW National Headquarters had announced new initiatives to combat veteran discrimination. The American Legion was developing educational materials to help service organizations and government agencies better understand the diversity of modern veterans. Most importantly, other veterans were finding their voices. The #PurpleHeartScar hashtag had become a rallying cry for veterans who had been silenced by similar experiences. Women who had been questioned about their military occupational specialties were speaking up. Minority veterans who had been told they didn't look military were sharing their stories. Young veterans who had been dismissed as probably just National Guard were demanding recognition for their service. Colonel James Wright, Maria's former commanding officer, had called to offer his support and to share his own perspective on the incident. Staff Sergeant Vasquez was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command, he told the reporter who interviewed him. Her courage under fire, her leadership abilities, and her dedication to her soldiers were exemplary. Anyone who questions her service is questioning the judgment of every officer who served with her, and every soldier who followed her into combat. The endorsement from her former commander meant more to Maria than all the media attention combined. Wright had been there on the worst day of her military career, had seen her bleeding and broken but still trying to save her soldiers. His words carried the weight of first-hand knowledge and combat credibility that no civilian bureaucrat could match. The Phoenix VA facility had become the reluctant center of a national debate about veteran services and discrimination. Henderson had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of the incident. The facility director had issued a public apology and announced comprehensive changes to their veteran verification procedures. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs had ordered a nationwide review of policies and training related to veteran identification and benefits processing. But for Maria, the institutional changes, while important, weren't the most significant outcome of her experience. What mattered most was the connection she had made with other veterans who had felt isolated and dismissed. Veterans who had thought they were alone in facing skepticism about their service were discovering a community of support and understanding. A group of female veterans had organized a peaceful demonstration outside the Phoenix VA, not to protest the facility itself, but to show support for Maria and to raise awareness about the challenges faced by non-traditional veterans. They wore their uniforms proudly, displaying their ribbons and medals, and held signs that read, "Service has many faces," and "Honor all veterans." Among the demonstrators was Sergeant First Class Rebecca Thompson, a combat medic who had served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. She had driven from Colorado specifically to support Maria after reading her story online. "When I saw what happened to her," Thompson explained to a reporter, "I saw myself. I saw every female veteran I know who has had to prove her service over and over again to people who never wore the uniform." 1 week after the VA incident, Maria found herself standing in the lobby of the CNN building in Atlanta, wearing her dress blue uniform and feeling more nervous than she had felt since her first day of basic training. The producer who had convinced her to do the interview had promised that it would be respectful and focused on the broader issues facing veterans. But Maria still felt exposed and vulnerable. The makeup artist who prepared her for the television appearance was a veteran herself, a former Air Force communications specialist who understood the weight of what Maria was about to do. "You're speaking for all of us who've been doubted," she said as she applied the finishing touches. "Every female veteran who's been told she doesn't look tough enough. Every young veteran who's been dismissed as inexperienced. Every minority veteran who's been questioned about whether they're really American enough to serve." The interview with Anderson Cooper was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. Cooper, known for his respectful treatment of military stories, began by asking about her service record and her decision to join the Army. Maria found herself talking about her childhood in El Paso, her family's immigrant background, and her desire to serve the country that had given her family opportunities they never would have had elsewhere. "When you first walked into that VA facility," Cooper asked, "did you have any indication that your service would be questioned?" Maria thought carefully before answering. "I think every veteran who doesn't fit the traditional stereotype has learned to expect some level of skepticism. Female veterans, especially young female veterans, face assumptions about their roles in the military and their experiences in combat zones. But I never imagined that I would be accused of fraud and forced to literally strip down to prove my wounds were real." The interview covered the broader implications of her experience, including the challenges faced by modern veterans in accessing services and recognition. Cooper asked about the diversity of today's military and the disconnect between public perception and reality when it came to who served and how they served. "The military I served in was incredibly diverse," Maria explained. "My squad included soldiers of every race, ethnicity, and background you can imagine. We had men and women serving side by side in combat roles, supporting each other, bleeding together, and sometimes dying together. The idea that only certain types of people can be real veterans is not just wrong. It's an insult to everyone who has served." After the interview, Maria was approached by representatives from several veterans advocacy organizations who wanted to discuss ways to turn her experience into lasting change. The Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America offered to help her develop educational materials about veteran diversity. The Women Marines Association wanted her to speak at their annual conference. The American Veterans Organization asked if she would consider testifying before Congress about discrimination in veteran services. The attention was overwhelming, but Maria was beginning to see how her personal trauma could be transformed into something meaningful for other veterans. She had never sought to become an advocate or public figure, but circumstances had thrust her into a position where her voice could make a difference for thousands of other veterans who had faced similar challenges. The most moving response to her story came from unexpected sources. A retired Army general wrote her a personal letter apologizing for the institutional failures that had led to her treatment and promising to use his influence to advocate for better training and sensitivity. In veteran services, a group of Gold Star mothers, women who had lost children in military service, sent her a bouquet of flowers with a note expressing their gratitude for her service and their outrage at her treatment. But perhaps the most significant impact was on policy and procedure. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced a comprehensive review of their veteran verification processes, with particular attention to unconscious bias and discrimination. The new guidelines would require additional training for all staff members on veteran diversity and would establish clear protocols for handling suspected cases of stolen valor that respected veteran dignity while protecting benefits integrity. Phoenix Villa, facility where Maria's ordeal had begun, became a pilot location for the new procedures. Henderson, who had returned from administrative leave after completing sensitivity training, personally called Maria to apologize again and to ask if she would be willing to help train staff members on appropriate veteran interaction. "I know I have no right to ask this of you," Henderson said during their phone conversation, "but your experience opened my eyes to prejudices I didn't even know I had. If you'd be willing to help us train our staff, we could prevent other veterans from going through what you experienced." Maria was torn about the request. Part of her wanted nothing more to do with the VA system or the people who had humiliated her. But another part of her recognized the opportunity to create real change, to ensure that other veterans wouldn't face the same discrimination and disrespect. "I'll consider it," Maria told Henderson, "but any training program would have to include veterans from diverse backgrounds sharing their experiences. This isn't just about my story. It's about the stories of thousands of veterans who have been marginalized or dismissed because they don't fit traditional stereotypes." The conversation with Henderson represented a turning point for Maria. She realized that she had a choice to make. She could retreat from the public attention and try to return to her quiet civilian life, or she could embrace the platform that circumstances had given her and use it to advocate for change. That evening, Maria sat in her apartment looking at the Purple Heart that had started everything. The medal that had been questioned, examined, and nearly taken from her had become a symbol of something larger than her individual service. It represented the courage and sacrifice of all veterans, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. She thought about Torres and Johnson, her soldiers who had died in the Eyed blast that earned her the Purple Heart. She wondered what they would think about her becoming an accidental advocate for veteran rights. She imagined them encouraging her to keep fighting, to use her voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. 6 months after the incident that changed her life, Maria stood before a joint session of the House and Senate Veterans Affairs committees, preparing to deliver testimony that could influence veteran services policy for years to come. The hearing room was packed with veterans, advocates, and media representatives, all there to hear her speak about discrimination in veteran services and the need for systemic reform. The journey from that humiliating day at the Phoenix VA to this moment in the halls of Congress had been transformative for Maria in ways she never could have imagined. What had started as a personal trauma had evolved into a national movement for veteran dignity and recognition. The hashtag Purple Heart Scar campaign had grown into a comprehensive advocacy effort that included policy recommendations, training programs, and support networks for veterans who had faced discrimination. In her prepared testimony, Maria outlined specific recommendations for improving veteran services and eliminating bias in the benefits process. She called for mandatory diversity training for all VI employees, standardized procedures for veteran verification that respected dignity while maintaining security, and the establishment of veteran advocate positions at every VA facility to help navigate disputes and misunderstandings. Honorable Senators and Representatives, Maria began, her voice steady and confident. I come before you today not as someone seeking sympathy or special treatment, but as a voice for the thousands of veterans who have been marginalized, questioned, or dismissed because they don't fit outdated stereotypes of what a service member should look like. She spoke about the evolution of the American military, describing how women now served in combat roles that had been close to them for generations, how the all-volunteer force had created a more diverse and educated military than ever before, and how veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts represented every demographic group in American society. The veteran sitting next to you might be a 22-year-old female Marine who served as a gunner on convoy operations in Afghanistan, Maria testified. She might be a 35-year-old Latino Army medic who saved lives in Iraq. She might be a 28-year-old African-American Navy corpsman who treated wounded soldiers in Syria. These veterans deserve the same respect and recognition as any veteran who served before them. The committee members asked thoughtful questions about implementation of new policies, funding requirements for enhanced training programs, and methods for measuring success in reducing discrimination. Several veterans on the committee shared their own experiences with assumptions and stereotypes, creating a moment of bipartisan understanding that transcended political divisions. Senator Patricia Williams, a Navy veteran herself, asked Maria about the psychological impact of having one service questioned. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, can you help the committee understand how discrimination in veteran services affects not just the individual veteran, but the veteran community as a whole? Maria thought carefully before responding. Senator, when a veteran's service is questioned or dismissed, it sends a message to all veterans that their sacrifice is conditional, that respect and recognition depend on fitting someone else's definition of what a warrior should look like. This creates division within the veteran community and discourages veterans from seeking the services they've earned. She continued, but more importantly, it perpetuates harmful stereotypes that limit our understanding of service and sacrifice. When we only recognize certain types of veterans as real veterans, we dishonor everyone who has served, and we fail to appreciate the full diversity of American military service. The hearing received extensive media coverage and prompted immediate action from both congressional committees. Within weeks, legislation was introduced to mandate comprehensive bias training for all VA employees and to establish formal procedures for addressing discrimination complaints. The bill, dubbed the Purple Heart Dignity Act, had bipartisan support and was expected to pass both chambers of Congress. But for Maria, the most meaningful outcome of her advocacy work wasn't the policy changes or media attention. It was the personal connection she had made with other veterans who had felt invisible and unheard. She received hundreds of letters and emails from veterans, thanking her for giving voice to their experiences and encouraging them to seek the benefits and recognition they deserved. A particularly moving letter came from a young Marine named David Chun, who had been told by a VA counselor that he didn't look like someone who had seen combat because of his slight build and soft-spoken demeanor. After reading Maria's story, Chun had found the courage to file a complaint about his treatment and had eventually received the PTSD benefits he needed. Your courage in speaking out gave me permission to demand the respect I had earned, Chun wrote. I realized that I didn't need to change who I was to be recognized as a veteran. The system needed to change to recognize veterans like us. Maria had also begun working with military recruiters to help them better prepare new service members for the challenges they might face as veterans. She spoke at military installations around the country, sharing her story and encouraging active duty personnel to be proud of their service regardless of how others might perceive them. The speaking engagements had led to an unexpected career change for Maria. Veterans organizations began hiring her as a consultant to help them develop more inclusive programs and outreach efforts. She found herself traveling the country, working with everyone from small VFW posts to major veteran service organizations, helping them understand and address the needs of diverse veteran populations. The work was challenging but fulfilling in ways that Maria had never expected. She was using her military leadership skills and her personal experience to create positive change for other veterans. The trauma of her VA experience had been transformed into a mission that gave her life new purpose and meaning. Dr. Martinez, the psychologist who had first helped Maria understand the psychological impact of her experience, became a close friend and collaborator. Together, they developed training materials that helped veteran service providers recognize and address their own unconscious biases. What you've accomplished, Dr. Martinez told Maria during one of their working sessions, is the transformation of personal trauma into collective healing. You've taken something that was done to you and used it to prevent similar harm to others. 2 years after that life-changing day at the Phoenix VA, Maria stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, preparing to receive the Presidential Citizens Medal for her advocacy work on behalf of veterans. The journey from humiliated veteran to nationally recognized advocate had been surreal, but it was the culmination of work that had touched thousands of lives and changed institutional policies across the country. The Purple Heart Dignity Act had passed Congress unanimously and had been signed into law 6 months earlier. VA facilities across the nation were implementing new training programs based on the model Maria had helped develop. Reports of veteran discrimination had decreased significantly, and satisfaction scores for veteran services had reached all-time highs. But the real measure of success wasn't in statistics or policy papers. It was in the individual stories of veterans who were finally receiving the respect and recognition they deserved. Maria's advocacy organization, Veterans of All Colors, had helped hundreds of veterans navigate discrimination complaints and access benefits they had been previously denied. The organization's headquarters in Phoenix had become a model for veteran advocacy, with satellite offices opening in cities across the country. The staff included veterans from every branch of service and every demographic group, reflecting the diversity that Maria had spent 2 years fighting to recognize and celebrate. President Harris, herself a champion of veteran causes, spoke eloquently about Maria's contributions during the award ceremony. Staff Sergeant Vasquez reminds us that courage takes many forms, the president said. The courage to serve your country in combat, the courage to seek help when you need it, and the courage to stand up and demand the dignity that all veterans deserve. As Maria accepted the medal, she thought about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. The IED blast in Afghanistan that had nearly killed her and earned her the Purple Heart, the humiliating experience at the VA that had stripped away her dignity but revealed her strength, the decision to speak out instead of remaining silent, the thousands of veterans who had found their voices because she had found hers. The ceremony was attended by many of the people who had been part of Maria's journey. Henderson, the former VA supervisor who had orchestrated Maria's humiliation, was there as well. She had become one of Maria's strongest allies in the fight for veteran dignity, using her experience and insider knowledge to help reform the system from within. I will never forgive myself for what I put you through, Henderson had told Maria during a private conversation before the ceremony. But I hope that the work we've done together since then has helped make amends, not just to you, but to all the veterans who deserved better treatment. Frank, the Korean War veteran who had been among the first to support Maria, sat in the front row wearing his dress uniform and beaming with pride. Dr. Martinez was there with several other psychologists who had joined the effort to address veteran mental health issues. Colonel Wright, Maria's former commanding officer, had flown in from his new assignment in Germany, specifically for the ceremony, but the guests who meant the most to Maria were the veterans who had shared their own stories of discrimination and had found the courage to demand better treatment. Rebecca Thompson, the combat medic from Colorado, had become a close friend and collaborator. David Chun, the Marine who had been told he didn't look like a combat veteran, was now studying law with plans to specialize in veteran advocacy. As the ceremony concluded and guests moved to the reception, Maria found herself in conversation with a young Army specialist who had recently returned from deployment. The soldier, a 20-year-old woman named Sarah Martinez, approached Maria with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am," she said, "I wanted to thank you personally. I'm getting ready to transition out of the Army next month, and I was terrified about dealing with the VA because I've heard so many horror stories. But because of your work, I know that I have rights and advocates, and I don't have to accept being treated poorly because of my age or gender." Conversations like this one reminded Maria why her advocacy work mattered. It wasn't about the awards or recognition. It was about ensuring that future generations of veterans would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved from the moment they hung up their uniforms. The Presidential Citizens Medal now hung in Maria's office alongside her Purple Heart and other military decorations. But the award that meant the most to her was a simple plaque given to her by the veterans at the Phoenix VA facility where her journey had begun. It read, "To Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez, thank you for teaching us that service has many faces and courage comes in many forms." Maria's story had become part of the larger narrative of American military service, a reminder that heroism wasn't limited to any particular demographic group and that the willingness to serve and sacrifice for one's country transcended traditional boundaries of race, gender, and background. The Phoenix VA facility had become a model for veteran services, with Henderson leading training sessions for VA employees across the country. The Phoenix Protocol, as it came to be known, established clear guidelines for respectful veteran verification and had been adopted by federal agencies beyond just the Department of Veterans Affairs. As Maria drove home to Tucson that evening, she reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had joined the Army to serve her country and had ended up serving the veteran community in a way she never could have imagined. The scars on her chest, which had once been a source of shame and trauma, had become symbols of resilience and the power of speaking truth to injustice. The Purple Heart that had been questioned and nearly taken from her now represented not just her individual sacrifice, but the collective service of all veterans who had been marginalized or dismissed. It had become a reminder that dignity and respect were not privileges to be earned repeatedly, but rights that belonged to everyone who had taken the oath to defend their country. Maria's story was far from over, but she had already accomplished something remarkable. She had transformed personal trauma into collective healing and had helped create a more inclusive and respectful environment for all veterans. In the end, that legacy meant more than any medal or recognition she could ever receive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.